classmate of my son Nico at Meridian Academy and is a senior. So I have known him since first grade. As I saw him this year, I had to look up to him as I greeted him with things. So it is my pleasure to introduce Casey Webel. As you can see, he's going to be talking about new excellence in women's health and biology, the problem, what to invest in, and where technology is headed. So take it away, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So thank you, Casey.
Yes, I think one of the biggest things that people were probably wondering when I took the stage is why am I speaking as a boy at a Women's History Month sort of conference. But as has been said throughout the entirety of the conference, it's really important that men are a part of this conversation. And as someone who is aspiring to work in healthcare and is already conducting research and social enterprising in the field, it becomes increasingly important that I'm understanding of the other side of healthcare. As was mentioned in Raina's presentation, there's an underrepresentation of women in STEM, and this is an issue that's actually reflected in the healthcare industry as well, and in healthcare outcomes for women. And so what I find interesting is that we're living in the most exciting point in history. We have some of the biggest developments in things like curing cancer in space, discovering new forms of matter, developing unprecedented technologies that have completely changed the way in which we learn, create, design, think, innovate. And despite all of that, we still have what I like to call this Sudoku board of problems for women. Each of these squares represents a disproportionality for women's health outcomes in 2023. So if you look at it, 1 in 5 of all female deaths are due to heart failure. Women are over 2 times more likely to have autoimmune diseases. They receive 6 years later of diagnosis. They're represented in under 20% of clinical trials, among so many other problems. And if you don't really understand the magnitude of these issues when seeing them in squares, then look to these dots right here. Each one of these dots represents a life lost just today due to postpartum hemorrhaging. And so this is something that happens to women after they've given birth, and there's an uncontrollable level of bleeding, also known as hemorrhagia, and this results in death. And so this is the equivalent of 4 Boeing 737 planes crashing in Nigeria every single day. And so that means by the end of the day today, when we all go to bed, 752 women will have died from postpartum hemorrhaging, either due to a lack of proper medical infrastructure with traditional birth attendants, or improper or late care. And so this is a problem that I'm really concerned about and interested in. And in order for us to understand sort of what are the root causes of these issues, we have to go back to what we call chronobiology, or the biology of time, the time-dependent cycles in our systems. And so the first one that we've probably all heard about and disrupted, especially if you're in high school and not sleeping well, is the circadian rhythm. This is the rhythm that sort of is the biological clock. It determines when your greatest cardiovascular strength is. It codes for things like movement, muscle activity, strength. And at different times during the day, if you're sleeping properly, you'll be able to maximize your biological capability because of the fact that your body is continuously going through several biological cycles. Then we have something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. This sort of system is what controls a lot of the circadian rhythm and circadian expression. It allows us to control many of the glands that secrete the hormones that give us these biological characteristics and properties, and its continued maintenance and functioning is what keeps our circadian rhythm stable. But it also codes for another type of chronobiological system called the ultradian rhythm. And so this ultradian rhythm is sort of a medium similar to the circadian rhythm, except it's much, much faster. So if you look here, you can see that it's actually happening in 90 minutes, 20 minutes, 90 minutes, 20 minutes. So it's a 1.5 hour cycle. And what's interesting about this cycle is that it codes for things like breathing or your heartbeat, things that are happening at a continuous pace. And there's something called this ultradian healing response, which is basically a cool down after you're experiencing a stress-activated event. So say you've been running for a long time, or you have a heart problem, heart flare-up, you'll have this ultradian healing response of around 20 minutes. So really, you're at your peak performance when you've been working for in between those 90-minute cycles. So if you're looking to optimize your productivity, look to your ultradian rhythm. This codes for some of the fast, specific biological movements and activities that we do, things like breathing, but also work looking at a screen. And so this is a perfect way for you to optimize your productivity, but it also has a huge role in female biology. And the reason for that is because of something called the infradian rhythm. This is also known as the menstrual cycle. So the infradian rhythm is the rhythm that lies between the ultradian and circadian rhythms. It's a mostly female-specific chronobiological rhythm. However, there are other types of infradian rhythms, with the menstrual cycle being the most prevalent one. And the real importance of this is that we see this huge fluctuation of hormones that we find in the reproductive system that code for a lot of female biological activity that is obviously really important to the furtherance of humanity. You know, without reproduction, none of us would continue to exist. And so this is why this cycle is so important. But what's unfortunate is that it's actually highly underrepresented in clinical studies. And so when you separate the reproductive system, we have across all of these 4 cycles in clinical studies, they're rarely actually considered correlated factors in health outcomes. So for example, if you're looking at something like, say, COVID-19, there are pre-existing female-specific conditions that can actually play a role in the development, spread, continuance, and expression of COVID-19 symptoms, yet it's very underrepresented in clinical studies. So for example, if a woman had, say, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that could play a huge role in how COVID-19 is expressed through her body, how susceptible she is to the disease, etc. And yet, since it's not represented in these clinical studies, a lot of times this goes undetected as a causal factor and leads to a significant delay in care. And so as someone who wants to go into the medical field, someone who's conducting research in the medical field, it becomes really important that I'm aware of these disparities and also aware of how these systems work, understanding them and allowing me to globalize my solutions and my technology for a broader variety of people. And so if we look to the broader reproductive system across sort of all, what's really important is that these hormones are actually somewhat advantageous. And if you think about it, women's hormones actually play a huge role in their cognition. Going back to what was said previously about, you know, would you go to your mom or your dad if you were in a big level of trouble, this actually plays a huge role in women's thinking. It's, as you can see, throughout the entire reproductive process, there are different sort of cognitive aspects of women that are enhanced under these conditions. So for menstruation, this is a more introspective phase. This is where they're seeking understanding and rest. For the follicular phase, there's creativity and mental development and increased memory. And for ovulation, we have synaptic boosts and creative bursts. This means that women can actually think faster, more creatively when in the ovulation stage. And then in the luteal phase, there's focus, precision, and a desire for completion. So as you can see, if you are to understand these systems, there's actually a large amount of cognitive potential that we can leverage from these biological systems. Yet, unfortunately, a lot of times they're viewed by men as hindrances. They're considered things like, oh, you're moody. Oh, you're so emotional. Oh, you have all these hormonal fluctuations. But what people don't realize is that this emotionality is something that can play a huge role in cognition and development. And this is also why it's so important to have women represented across different workspaces. We don't know when they're going to be creative, introspective, have synaptic boosts. All of these essentially biological superpowers that we could be leveraging are lost to this sort of thinly veiled barrier of bias and sexism. And so what I want to talk about is this challenge with women's health. Why are we experiencing we're seeing all of these terrible health outcomes for a lot of women, particularly women of color? This is also a product of people not believing women when they express their pain, especially black women. And that plays into something called the superwoman schema, which I could talk a lot about, but essentially it's a concept that even Bell Hooks introduced, and I think we have a couple of books by her there, so those are very good, you should go check those out. But essentially it's this idea that women are sort of forced into this notion of perfection, and so whenever they're expressing pain, it's often overlooked or undermined. And this is a huge problem that again plays into these negative health outcomes. But back on the question of equality. What if we wanted to make the number 7 for both women? Equality tells us that we should do 5 plus 2 for everyone. But the 5 plus 2 mold doesn't fit everyone. Some people might need 3 plus 4, or 6 plus 1, or 7 plus 0. This is why we need equity in the space, and not equality. We need equal outcomes for everyone, but not through the same system, not through the same pipeline. And this is really, really important. And so this brings me to my problem-solving framework. What I've used to build things like prosthetic arms and microfinancing platforms, race and class responsive technology. What I've used to create workshops that have encountered over 75,000 students across 80 countries. This is the framework that we need, and this is the framework that will also help women's health outcomes. So we start with the outcome. We start with what is the symptom that's being expressed, what is the thing that we want to prevent. It might be polycystic ovarian syndrome, inflammation, death, etc. Then we look to the root cause. This is the step that's often overlooked in medicine. We try to treat the symptoms instead of treating the underlying reason that's causing those symptoms. And so once we look to the root cause, we then develop solutions to address each of those factors. So it might be something with the reproductive system, it might be bleeding, it might be an internal issue. By addressing those root problems, we eliminate the symptoms, but we also eliminate the possibility of those symptoms to rise again. And that's something that's really huge in medicine, regenerative medicine, precision medicine. It's not just treating symptoms, but treating those etiologies, or the reasons for which they're actually occurring. And so, this is the point. We look at the factors, and then focusing on when it comes to women's health, start with diagnosis, then look to prevention, and then to treatment. Here we're again addressing all of these similar problems, and that's why the developments of technology today that are so astounding, it's crazy to think that we don't have systems for automated diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome, or a preventative measure for endometriosis. In fact, if we look to some of the biggest rates for all of these, some of the biggest medical development rates for all of 3 of the major conditions that women have faced, we see 10%, 15%, 11% prevention rates. Those are astoundingly low. And then if we look to the actual treatments, we find that there's a really limited solvency. For polycystic ovarian syndrome, no cases, or it says most cases of PCOS can't be prevented, so there's no cure there. You're often told to take medicine or use a variety of different devices and measurement systems. For menorrhagia, they just do a series of tests to determine your diagnosis, then try to treat the excessive bleeding, but once again, there's very limited solvency and there's only your menstrual cycle, which are things that hopefully, as just a normal human being, you would want to do on a daily basis. So really, they're just telling you to make no change to your life or be a little bit healthier and hope to eliminate one of the deadliest female-specific diseases. And so ultimately, we're seeing that this existing system is not working. Then, if we look at some of the medical prescriptions that women can get, things like contraceptives and birth control, they have higher rates, but again, we should be reaching the 90% and higher level. For diseases like prostate cancer, they're being tackled more widely. Things that affect mostly men, they're being tackled widely, getting diagnosed